to the ongoing and surging violence in Indianapolis. As you know, our city was a subject of focus in a recent White House meeting with the President of the United States, in which our Fraternal Order of Police was able to highlight the local broken system of catch and release criminal justice in Indianapolis. You will recall also that myself and Reverend Charles Harrison stood at the corner of Illinois and Maryland on September 24, 2019, and we outlined a public all-hands-on-deck call to action following a mass shooting that occurred at that very intersection over the prior weekend, in which 6 people were shot, 3 juveniles and 3 adults. And this violent incident was one of many that occurred throughout our city in a matter of 48 hours, in which a total of 10 people were shot in our city. We called then on all elected, appointed, civic, and business leaders to join together and engage on this issue of the surging violence in our city. In fact, we expressed our shock at the lack of outcry expressed following multiple people being shot in the heart of our city, which is known for its hospitality and safety. And for that reason, we publicly asked, where's the outrage? And when will our leaders in our community rise up and say that this violence is unacceptable, and then place a focus on the need for acts of intervention and prevention? You see, our police officers and our residents are stuck in the middle of this. They're stuck in the middle of this violence, and they need to see a sense of urgency from trusted voices in our community. In fact, we made clear that we must do more and we must make a change. Instead of speaking out, our call to action was met with stunning silence, and the violence has raged on. And in the interim, in just the past 54 days alone, Indianapolis has had at least 109 people shot, 44 people stabbed, and 28 people have been killed. That is 153 people shot or stabbed in less than 2 months. To provide context, if we maintain this rate of violence, which is surging in our community, if we maintain it for a year, we would have 736 people shot, 297 people stabbed, and 189 of our fellow neighbors murdered, all of which is significantly higher than the record levels we have already experienced for the past 4 years. And we have just learned that this past year of 2019, we were only 7 under our all-time record level for homicides, 6 under for murders. And that was in this past year of 2000 as compared to 2018. Yet here is the key point that was not discussed yesterday. We are exceeding on all other levels of violent attacks in our city. And again, we ask, where is the outrage? Now, although our calls for action have been, and quite frankly, they continue to be met with silence from our local leaders, our residents and our police officers have made their thoughts strongly known by expressing their fears about the violence and their frustrations about the lack of response from our local elected, appointed, civic, and business leaders. Now, while heartbreaking, we have not lost hope. Instead, we have been encouraged by the urgency and the focus that has been placed on this issue by the President of the United States and our federal law enforcement partners. And we are hopeful to see a similar focus placed on these issues from our partners in the Indiana legislature and from the Governor of Indiana. Today, I stand before you on behalf of our 3,000 active and retired law enforcement officers and their families. And we are pleased to be joined by a leading voice from our faith community in our neighborhoods, Reverend Charles Harrison. Together, we are here to stand shoulder to shoulder and publicly say, enough is enough when it comes to the violence in our city. Now, as we have made clear for several months now, this is not about politics. It is about people. And people are dying and being critically injured in our streets, and none of our local leaders seem to care or at least express their concern about the issue. Now, in the face of this silence from our local leaders, others are rising up to say that this violence is unacceptable. And our faith and neighborhood partners are placing a focus on the need for acts of intervention and prevention. And as a result, today we are collectively calling for several local and state legislative actions to be taken. But let me explain to you why these actions are so critically important. Context before content. Our officers keep arresting many of the same offenders due to a broken system of catch and release criminal justice. We want to make clear, we are not advocating for or against cash bail bond structures, especially for low-level offenses and first-time offenders. Rather, we are highlighting the misguided steps of recent years that have significantly reduced bond thresholds for violent offenders, many of which never even appear before a judge prior to release. For example, those arrested in Marion County receive an automatic $500 bond for the following felony arrest, such as battery, criminal confinement, criminal gang activity, criminal recklessness, escape, intimidation, pointing a firearm, residential entry, resisting law enforcement, stalking, and strangulation. Now, every single one of those involve violence. It's important to note that many of these crimes are also components of domestic violence and are often precursors for lethality without intervention, which may include detention to de-escalate such situations. This is why we call for every such alleged offender to appear before a judge to ensure consistency and safety. Now, we do recognize our criminal justice partners are working in good faith with limited resources that they have. And their challenges are compounded by mandates from the state of Indiana that require local jails to house state prisoners under what's called House Enrolled Act 1006. Now, this mandate alone takes up approximately 350 jail beds every day in Marion County. Could you imagine the difference that could be made if those jail beds were freed up for us to retain the people that are committing acts of violence today? We also have the highest number of offenders who are on GPS monitored release. That's the highest number in the nation. And as such, our system and those assigned to monitor this program are overloaded. And often what should be immediate investigations upon violations of such a program are often delayed, sometimes by days. And we are the only county in Indiana that does not immediately launch an investigation when a violation occurs. And even when a violator is apprehended, remember this, they are typically charged with the crime of escape. Guess what that gets them? A $500 bond for the charge of escape, and they are cycled back out onto our streets. How does this make sense to anyone? You see, this revolving door of justice is a big problem, and it's a mistake. And frankly, our law enforcement officers believe that it's dangerous. Proof positive is our officers are often arresting offenders with pending violent felony and or gun charges, or are having to engage in vehicle and foot chases of convicted offenders who are violating the terms of their GPS monitoring system. And worse yet, many of the murder victims and the suspects in Indianapolis are found to have criminal convictions that if they were still incarcerated according to their sentences for their prior crimes of violence, another murder could have been prevented because one or both of the parties would not have been present for the homicide to occur. Please fact check us on this point. You're the media. You can do this. We strongly encourage all media outlets to research the criminal history convictions and the sentencing of those who are identified as victims or suspects in murders. Perhaps you will find what our officers know. Many of our murders are preventable. And if our local criminal justice system would simply enforce the rules we have and ensure accountability for those convicted of felonious acts, we would be in a much better position. Additionally, our juvenile justice system is failing our children, their parents, and our community. Thankfully, this was addressed by Mayor Joe Hogsett just yesterday in his inauguration speech, in which he pointed to an antiquated juvenile justice system. Furthermore, go and ask any police officer in this city, and they will tell you our juvenile justice system is a joke. Our officers are being called to intervene, yet they lack the tools of effective intervention, such as curfews, delinquency offenses, and often, even when our officers do arrest a juvenile for crimes, they are instructed, in fact, they are ordered, to not take the juveniles to the detention facility and instead simply release them to a family member. What is this telling our juveniles? It is reinforcing a lack of accountability, and it's empowering them to escalate their criminal behavior without fear of any consequences. That is why we are now seeing so many juveniles in our city unlawfully carrying guns and being quick to use them to resolve any interpersonal conflicts. We are seeing this all the time, and so are you. This is unacceptable, and others need to say so. Yet again, we continue to see these unacceptable levels of violence day in and day out, night in and night out. In fact, in the past 10 days alone, just the last 10 days, we have had 23 people shot, 13 people stabbed, and 5 people killed. Of the 5 killed in the last 10 days, 2 have been babies and 2 have been women. Just as troubling are the statistics that were published by the Indianapolis Star about this time last year, which showed that on December 23, 2018, when they published their report, it outlined that 3 out of every 4 criminal homicide victims were African American. And the percentage gap between black male murder victims outpaces all other males combined within every age bracket. And it's the widest for the 18 to 24-year-old age group. Again, we are asking the question, why? And where is the outcry and emergent actions by our leaders and within our neighborhoods? So what can be done at the local and state level? This is why, today, our Indianapolis Fraternal Order of Police is calling upon local and state leaders, especially in our city county council, our Indiana state legislature, our mayor, and our governor, for the following action items. First, we must hear, we have to hear, our local leaders say that they are outraged by this violence and that it is unacceptable. Second, we need to establish a Commission on Criminal Justice Outcomes to provide a public review of low bond structures and this catch and release criminal justice system, specifically for repeat convicted offenders. Third, every arrestee intake should be reviewed by a judge, not a computer program, but by a judge, much like we formerly had at the Adult Processing Center 24 hours a day. Fourth, we must publicly address the lack of accountability for violators in our local juvenile justice system. Fifth, we call upon the governor and the State House to identify solutions that will relieve the local pressure felt by the state mandates within House Enrolled Act 1006 that takes up a disproportionate number of jail beds in Marion County. Remember, 350 jail beds on average every day. Sixth, we call for the establishment, under the Commission of Criminal Justice Outcomes, of a public database to track the criminal histories focusing on prior convictions and dispositions of prior criminal cases for every suspect and victim of homicides, non-fatal shootings, stabbings, and other aggravated assaults. Again, what you see will astonish you. And in this time of openness and transparency, there is no reason why we can't have this public information collected into a database for all to see. Seventh, we must analyze the disproportionality of black males related to murders in our city. And we also want to review the African American infant and toddler mortality rates in our city. Research has shown there is an inherent correlation in infant mortality rates, poverty, and ongoing criminal activity. Lives in our city have to matter, and people need to say so. So it is our goal to remain focused on this issue of violence and the diminished value placed upon the sanctity of life in our city. Let me be clear. This is not a gun violence issue. It is a people violence issue. That is why our faith-based partners can be such a help to address the head and heart challenges behind all of this. We are reminded that what is more important than what is in someone's hands is what is in their heads and their hearts. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in the midst of a perfect storm of an overburdened criminal justice system that's compounded by a mental health crisis and an opioid epidemic. Yet these steps that we have outlined will facilitate significant discussion, identification, and inaction of several policy, infrastructure, and logistical solutions. Now, it sounds like a lot, but if we stay focused on these primary things listed above, which we as public sector leaders do have ownership and a responsibility for, we can make significant improvements and we can save lives. You see, working together works, and together we can do this. Now, to prove that, Reverend Harrison is here, who also represents not just his neighborhoods throughout our city and his local church, but the 10-Point Coalition as well. And I've asked him if he would come forward and speak to the outcomes of their efforts over this last year. We want to take some questions, but we also want to speak specifically to some of these numbers that have been recently released and are planned to be released at the beginning of next week. Reverend Harrison.
Thank you so much, Rick, for the invitation. And I just wanted to share that sometimes I think there is a disconnect with the numbers that are being reported and how people feel in the neighborhoods. We reported yesterday that this year we had 171 homicides compared to 178 in 2018. We had 152 murders compared to 158 in 2018. What we're not talking about, and it's going to be released on Monday, is the escalation in non-fatal shootings in the city. And we got a report just a few days, about 5 days ago, as of 12/27, we were already at 518 non-fatal shootings compared to the same date of 2018, 489. We know there's been 16 non-fatal shootings since the 27th of December. So you're probably looking at about 534 non-fatal shootings. I've shared this publicly on social media and also in interviews. We are fortunate, based on the number of non-fatal shootings, that we did not break another homicide record and criminal homicide record for the 5th year in a row. Thankfully, some bad shot selection and the advancement in technology, we were able to save more lives. So we are concerned because this has been since 2012. We have seen, a 7 or 8 year surge in the level of violence in the city of Indianapolis, and we have to get a hold of this violence and really get it going in the right direction in all of our categories. Rick wanted me to talk a little bit about the partnerships that exist in particularly the 46208 zip code, and it is a strong collaborative partnership really with INPD, Neighborhood Association, community stakeholders, and the city, as collectively we have come together to really try to address this growing problem in the city. And since the violence is so random, certainly it is challenging. In 2019, in the 46208 zip code, we saw a significant reduction in the level of violence and homicides. There was a reduction of 7 less homicides in the combined neighborhoods of Butler, Tarkington, Crown Hill, Highland vicinity, and the United Northwest area. Butler, Tarkington, and Highland vicinity both went a year without a homicide for the 3rd time in 4 years. Butler, Tarkington has gone without a homicide in the years of 2016, 2017, and 2018. Highland vicinity has gone without a homicide in the years 2017, 2018, and 2019. This year, in the 46208 zip code, Butler Tarkington seen 2 less homicides, Crown Hill seen 2 less homicides, and the United Northwest area, which had 10 homicides in 2018, only had 7 homicides this year, so a reduction of 3. So in that area, we saw 7 less homicides in those combined neighborhoods. And I wanted to highlight that because every year we hear about the surge in violence, there are a lot of good things going on in the city with a lot of faith-based organizations working with the city and law enforcement. And what we really hope to do, and I have been having conversations with Mayor Hogsett and City County Council President Bob Osley and Shauna Majors, as to how we begin to bring all of the assets together so that we're working together, and the same model that we're using in Butler, Tarkington, Crown Hill, Unwa, and Highland vicinity, we can use in other hotspot neighborhoods across the city. We can get a hold of this violence. We can go in the right direction, but let's not mistake ourselves. This year, 2019, was a mixed bag. We were down in criminal homicides slightly and murders, but we were up in all the other categories, and that's what is concerning as we stand here today.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Rick, if you could just easily talk about this. You all were just talking about teenagers, adolescents getting their hands on guns. We just had an incident this afternoon where a 14-year-old accidentally shot a sibling. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, that's what I was just learning about as well. You know, in the last hour of us having this press conference, prior to it, we learned of another child shot, right? Again, these are our children. And if they're not being the victims of the crime, they're definitely the witnesses of the crimes. And there's lifelong impacts. And sometimes we are cutting lives short or critically injuring and causing lifelong injuries. And oftentimes, folks, the science shows it, that when our children are witnessing violence, they have a significantly higher propensity to then commit violence later in life if there's no intervention. That's why it's so critically important that we have a strong juvenile justice system, but also strong intervention steps through the Department of Child Services and our local child advocates as well. What is going on here in Indianapolis is frustrating, because yesterday, the facts are the facts, right? Thankfully, thank God, our homicide numbers have come down a little. Every life counts, and we don't diminish that at all. But it is misleading to suggest that because your murder numbers are slightly lower, that somehow overall violence is declining. It is not. And not only is it not declining, it is rapidly surging. We got the breakdown of the numbers last year. What didn't get discussed in there is that the last 2 months of the calendar year are the highest months for murders, on top of all the non-fatal shootings. In fact, in terms of the shootings in just the last 54 days, they equate to 28, nearly 30% of all the shootings for the year in just the last 2 months. What's that tell us? It tells us that it is escalating rapidly. And what we have tried to make clear is, folks, this is not a numbers game, nor should we play games with the numbers. The clock resets at the beginning of the year, but the count does not. That is why we haven't reset our count and said we're zeroing it out. We are keeping it going in the overlap here. I think it would be good for us to start looking at 3-month rolling numbers, right? So that we have a good fix on what's going on in our community. And remember, it's not just shootings. In the last 54 days, nearly 40% of the attacks involved an edged weapon. That reminds us of the threats that our officers face every single day from not just firearms, but edged weapons, and quite frankly, any other weapon somebody who is hell-bent on committing an act of violence will use. And that is surging in our community.
So have you had a chance to talk to the new chief, and if not, what would that conversation be? And that's a question for both of you.
I spoke to Chief Taylor and Assistant Chief Bailey this morning. We had a very productive meeting. It was very in-depth. I shared with them these key points that we would be discussing today. You have not heard any dissension from our police department about the points that we are making. That should tell you one thing. Number two, I am hopeful that Chief Taylor, who has a good grasp on this situation, will be coming forward with some points of his own that he wants to make. If you note in his swearing in speech, he pointed out that the time has come for us to have some very difficult discussions in our community. and he's absolutely right. We can't just be outraged when it is to a specific political point, political agenda that certain constituencies may have. We have to be outraged when violence occurs anywhere in our community. And here's what we're seeing in Indianapolis. It's now moved throughout the entire city in many areas that often have not seen this level of violence. And even more so, it's moving into the surrounding communities. So the folks in Greenwood and Carmel and Greenfield and Avon, they should be asking themselves, why do I care about this? Here's the answer. It's coming to a neighborhood near you. In fact, it is already there. We have already heard from our local surrounding sheriffs and local law enforcement leaders who are outraged about the violence that is spilling over into their communities. In fact, we are hopeful that within the very near future, perhaps within the next couple of weeks, we will host a meeting of those sheriffs and local law enforcement leaders here at the Indianapolis FOP to talk about the contributing factors that are occurring here in our county. But they know the system's broken here and it's creating this spillover effect.
Were you at all disappointed to hear Chief Taylor say there would be very few changes in the command structure at IMPD and the personnel in command?
No, because here's what the deal is, right? For years now, what we have seen is that when people talk about violence, the record-setting levels of murders, the tendency has been to point the finger at the law enforcement officers in the police department. What we're here to tell you today is your police department, they're working their tails off. They're doing a very good job. They're arresting the bad folks, but the broken system is letting them right back out. You will see in recent headlines of significant convictions that we have had for people who have committed murder, double murders, triple murders, that have received over 100-year sentences now. If you go back and research their criminal conviction history, they had prior conviction histories that had they been held accountable, those murders would not have occurred. Do you see what I'm saying? And so that's why we need this database to be able to track that, because we know this is what's going to happen. The public will quickly see it's not your police officers. They're doing their part. It's the system that's failing us. And then people are going to ask the question, who's making those decisions and why? And remember, we're not making it personal. We're not pointing fingers at our judges, our prosecutors, or public defenders. What I'm saying to you is they're playing the cards that they're dealt. They're bad cards. And we need to get them help so they can make better decisions. But gone need to be the days that if you commit an act of violence, you get time served, suspend the rest of your entire sentence, and release back out onto our streets. There must be accountability when you commit an act of violence on another resident, visitor in our community.
How can the public partner with you in these recommendations when I see the list? And
Yeah.
now I've talked to more people who were disengaged in the past and now are ready to do something. They just have no idea where to start, but they're not law enforcement, they're not a faith
Yeah,
leader.
and that's exactly what we're hearing, right? From residents.
Yeah.
We're hearing it from visitors. Remember, we're also hearing it from people who drive in, commute in from the surrounding counties, who are fearful in those commutes into the city and back out. We're hearing from people who don't live in the city, but they come here for sporting events, a Colts game, a Pacers game, whatever the case may be. They're concerned. We're hearing more and more people say, I used to come to downtown Indianapolis, but I don't bring my family anymore. Those are heartbreaking things to hear, especially for law enforcement officers and community leaders. What we're hearing, though, is folks saying, what can I do? I will get engaged now. We have ran this hashtag, Where's the Outrage, for 3 months now. What we're now seeing is people starting to use the hashtag, I am outraged. That's a very simple way to speak out via social media, but we need them to contact their local leaders. And remember, not politics, it's people. So we're talking about elected leaders, but we're also talking about appointed leaders, like our chiefs and command staffs of police departments. We're talking about civic leaders, like neighborhood leaders, neighborhood associations. Here's the big one. We're talking about our business leaders. Contact the folks who are running these large organizations in our city and remind them of their obligation in this discussion as well. We've reached out to our Indianapolis Chamber of Commerce. We have had a meeting with them, and we're hopeful for more meetings because it's going to take all of us coming to the table to address this.
Just to add one thing to that, there are discussions going on right now. I think CICF is involved in it and doing a good job. Shoshana Majors with the city. How do we bring all of the assets that the city has together so that we're working together toward this common cause of not just reducing the violence, but addressing the root causes, the systemic causes that is leading young people down the wrong path. We have a lot of gifted young people that are using their talents in a negative way, and our challenge is, how do we get them, one, to start handling conflicts in a nonviolent way, and then using their talents in a positive way so that they can become productive citizens. A lot of them are very gifted out there, but they're caught up in the cycle, and we got to help break the cycle and get them out of the cycle. And I think what you're going to see from the mayor's office in partnership with the community is bringing all of the resources together so that we can begin reaching them at a younger age, at a critical time in their life, so that we can reduce the level of violence that we're seeing in neighborhoods all across the city. So those conversations are happening, and we want to invite everybody to the table, because everybody's role is going to be important in this, because there's no one group or one agency can curb the pattern of violence alone. It's going to take the village. Okay, Lily, you was going to ask a question?
You answered it.
And remember, in this past year, our Indianapolis FOP launched what we call the Think Bigger initiative. And what we have very publicly said is that when we set our differences aside and think bigger about the challenges that we face, there's nothing we cannot overcome. This is a prime example of that. It's on our building, outside. We are committed to this. We, as an FOP, rank and file law enforcement officers in our city, we are investing significant amounts of money into better education and awareness campaigns related to police-citizen interactions, so that we hopefully avoid unnecessary tragedies that can occur in our community. But at the same time, as a community, we need to think bigger about these infrastructure issues, funding issues, the leveraging of our resources that we have. I consistently get asked, about the mayor, right? I want to reaffirm this again. I've been very consistent in this. The mayor is a good man. I consider him a friend. We supported him in his re-election efforts. That's why it's so important for people to hear us publicly say, we have to hear from him. He has to speak up. He has to say that this is unacceptable as the leader of our city. But then he also has the bully pulpit and the ability to leverage all these resources. But it's going to take our legislative branch also acting. And we've met with Council President Bob Osley, and we're hopeful to see bipartisan support for this Commission on Criminal Justice Outcomes. For so long, we've talked about important things like reforms to criminal justice, sentencing evaluations, all those other things. Now what we're talking about is the outcomes that we're seeing from that. We have to review them because it is not working.
The mayor has called violent crime acceptable on many occasions. What else are you looking from him and other leaders from that communication standpoint? Like, what level of outrage are you seeking?
Well, you said he has said it's acceptable. You meant unacceptable?
No, unacceptable is what I said.
Perhaps he has. I've not heard him say that. Again, it's not about any one individual, but as the mayor, he's also been our U.S. attorney. He was well known for pounding podiums and saying that crime and violence was unacceptable in that role. He definitely has the opportunity to do it now. And again, I don't want to make this personal, and I'm not pointing fingers. We are all on the same team here. But he's the quarterback, and we need him to step up. Now would be an appropriate time to pound the table. I'm just going to ask you folks, our outgoing chief, he referred to, he wanted to avoid having an emotional response. Well, I would suggest to you that's exactly what we need right now, is a little bit of emotion. When our babies, our women, our young men are being murdered left and right in our streets, being shot, being stabbed, this is the time to get emotional about it. It is the time to pound a podium and say, I am outraged. Because once we do that, then we can talk about how we're going to fix it. But as you've seen, there's been no discussions about that as of yet. And so we're confident that if we can get this public discussion, again, a transparent process in place, we can start tackling some of these solutions.
Should the mayor find a public service director?
I don't think that has anything to do with it, quite honestly. We have a chief of police who's very capable. The mayor made very clear and has consistently, He is the Director of Public Safety, and he has also made clear the buck stops with him, and he's absolutely right. We have more than enough capable folks who can come to the table and identify solutions. Same thing, a public safety director, one individual, no one individual can do this. We have supported the elimination of a director of public safety. What we need is everybody coming to the table. I would even hope to see a media outlet perhaps even help us convene a town hall meeting, talk about some of these issues, let's hear from the judges. What are their challenges? It has to be frustrating when you can't keep people in jail because of an overcrowding issue that's created by a mandate from the state that you have no control over. That has to be pretty darn frustrating. How do you pick and choose who you're going to keep and who you're going to release? But then the real key component is, how do we explain to families of victims that the person who committed the act of violence upon their loved one should have still been in jail or prison? We have always focused on education, prevention, intervention, and community collaboration. Our primary focus is on education, prevention, and collaboration. But there is a need, and it is a requirement that we have intervention. And for some reason over the last, specifically 4 to 5 years, we have really moved away from those discussions, and I think it's time that we circle back to them.
So would you say the biggest holdup is getting those local leaders to the table?
I don't think that I think there's an extreme willingness. I think everybody's just looking to the top for a nod to say, let's get after this. This is the time to do it now. I shared yesterday. I felt like yesterday was a missed opportunity. I did. We had a speech where we're going to talk about the next 4 years, the conclusion of a decade, the beginning of a new decade. That was the opportunity, in my opinion, to truly discuss what is at hand here. To then say, well, the murder numbers are down. Again, as I've shared, that's just a part of the equation, right? And can be misleading to people. But this is what I know. Residents and our police officers, they know that violence is not down. It is up overall, and it is surging and getting worse. There's no signs of it slowing. Other questions? I want to express my appreciation again to Reverend Harrison. I try to say this anytime I can. This man and I have stood together for well over a decade now, shoulder to shoulder, oftentimes in the middle of the streets of our city, both in uniform and out of uniform for me. You too, I guess. Yeah. It is because we care about what is going on here. We care about the lives that are being affected, as does everyone else here. Council President Vop Osley said yesterday, everyone who's getting involved in local government is doing it because they want to make their neighborhoods better, and I completely agree. Let's come together, let's work together, and together we can do this. But we must think bigger about the challenges that we face and speak out. Anything else? We'll be available for one-off questions, discussions. You also have information with you, and I appreciate all of you coming out here today. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.